Okay, let's get started. Good morning again. I'm Chris Rebelo. I am the Senior Director of Communications here at the Buck Institute. It is my thrill and honor to welcome you to today's event, which will hopefully help us all live better longer. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get into the actual event is please put your phones on silent if you can, because we don't want those buzzings getting in the way of content. And also, I'd like to keep the fire marshal happy by pointing out the exits, the emergency exits at the back of the auditorium. So today, we're going to talk about evolutionary biology and genetics. A little unusual for me. I have super enjoyed preparing for this one, and I hope that you will be part of the conversation. Who's new to the Buck? We have any newbies here today? Great. So glad you could come and enjoy us. Rather than having me talk about our science and how great it is, we have a short video for you to see. So, Jorn, go for it.
The Buck Institute is interested in understanding aging, not only to make us live longer, but to actually alleviate and suppress the development of diseases.
Chronic disease is the great health challenge of our time. Aging is the main driver of chronic disease. To eliminate chronic disease, we must harness the biology of aging so we can live healthy longer. The Buck Institute is the world's first research organization dedicated solely to the biology of aging. We work with the building blocks of biology to understand how we age.
The Buck is concentrating on really trying to go to the root of the problem, so understanding that we can sort of intervene really early.
The Buck Institute is probably the best place in the world to be working on aging because there's so many different aspects of aging that are being studied. It's key because no one lab can do it all.
Our scientific explorers are brilliant, curious, and committed.
The idea that you could actually develop drugs that slow down the aging process was really something that 20 or 30 years ago people thought this cannot be done. Not only can it be done, but we will do it.
The pieces are in place. And we are in a unique position to put them together. Our world is defined by paradigm shifts, created by scientific discoveries. The biology of aging is the next frontier.
We're working toward a world where healthcare is better. It's a world where if we can eradicate the aging component to disease, we're all going to live healthier and longer.
It's just an incredible vision. It really will, surpass anything else that we've ever seen before.
We are inviting you to a future of aging without illness. It's happening today, and it's happening here. Join us.
All right. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank our sponsors. Some of them are here today, so thank you very much. All the sponsors are listed in your program. If it makes sense, please use their businesses because it helps us. Also I want to make sure that everybody has note cards so that you can write your questions down. We have volunteers that pick up those note cards and bring them to me up on the stage. You can ask a question anytime during the event. If you need more note cards, just raise your hands and we will take care of you. Okay, and also we have a lot of folks on Zoom today. I'm now looking at the camera and waving. You too get to ask questions. Just enter them in the Q&A section of the Zoom window and somebody will get those questions up to me as well. Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deena Emera. She is a senior scientist and writer in residence in our Center for Healthy Aging for Women. You can read all about Deena's varied and prestigious educational background in your program. Let me tell you that she has published academic articles on topics ranging from the evolution of the brain, our hands, and the uterus. So we'll also be talking about her book. You'll understand why she is a writer in residence. Deena, come on up. So my usual disclaimer, Deena's a doctor, but she's a PhD. She's not an MD. So she's not equipped or ready to give any medical advice. We always urge you to talk to your doctor before you take any action based on anything you hear during today's seminar. Also, you're going to get a follow-up email later today or tomorrow that has a link to the video and also has links to some of the content that we're going to be talking about today. So you don't need to take notes unless you want to. Just kick back, enjoy, and come up with good questions. Okay, so, and final thing, can you hear me okay? All right, if you have a problem hearing, raise your hand and we'll boost the sound here.
Can you hear me? Yes.
All right, so. I know, I told her that slide would be a winner. We're done now. We can leave. Everybody's happy. So Deena, you study evolution, evolutionary genetics, evolutionary biology. What the heck is that? and why did you suggest this slide?
Okay, so what you're seeing here is a baby gorilla, an infant gorilla and an infant human. I, for the longest time, was interested in primates. So I remember as a kid going to the zoo and spending all my time at the primate exhibits. I was just fascinated with the apes, with the monkeys. And the thing that I really was fixated on, obviously all of the animals, the different monkeys, the different apes, are very different from us. But when I looked at their faces, they also looked weirdly human, and I thought that was fascinating. I think literally just looking at their faces, you could see the evolutionary connections that tied us all together. So I love this image because it kind of reflects that. So these are, like I said, two baby apes. And you can see in the image that they're responding the same way to a cold stethoscope on their chest. Their mouths are open, they're sort of flinging their arms out. And we know that that's a reflex. It's called the Moro reflex or the startle reflex. All monkeys and apes do this. And so I think it really points to those sort of deep biological connections that we all share together. And, as I evolved as a scientist, these connections are interesting, but really when you think about it, we share ancestry with these animals. So it's actually not that surprising that we would share things like the Moro reflex. So I became much more interested in the differences, sort of how they evolve and why they evolve. But this is a cute picture, so I like to show it.
What's your focus? Like, how do evolutionary biologists and geneticists, what do they bring to the big picture?
I think that, I'm focused a lot on why our bodies are the way they are now, and I think to really understand that, you need to look deep in our history. So many features of our biology, are not human specific. In fact, none of them really are. They, came at different points in our evolutionary history, and to understand them, you need to go back to that history and figure out, well, why did that trait evolve? How did it evolve? So that's the sort of thing that I focus on in my work.
Got it. So Deena's written a book. It's pretty darn cool. If you are at all interested in how and why the female form came to be, I suggest you read it. It's a good read. I've learned a lot. We're going to be talking about some of it today, but believe me, there are things in here that we're not going to have time to talk about that are really fascinating. So, what brought you to write the book?
Yeah, I would say that the idea for the book actually came quite a long time ago when I was a graduate student. So my PhD was on the evolution of pregnancy. And specifically, I was really interested in the maternal tissues that evolved to allow us to grow our babies inside our bodies instead of in an eggshell, which is how the earliest mammals grew their babies. So I was studying for my qualifying exam. I distinctly remember when I had this sort of epiphany that I needed to write the book, which was many, many years ago. I was studying for my qualifying exam. I was diving deep into everything that's known about why pregnancy evolved, how it evolved. And I was learning so much cool stuff, and I thought, other women would want to know this. It was, in particular, very personal for me because I was also, as I was studying for that exam, I was pregnant with my first baby. And so I think I was very intellectually interested in everything I was learning, but also personally interested because I was literally going through, my first pregnancy. So, oh gosh, that was, decades ago. And I didn't write the book then. I finished my PhD, obviously. I had 3 more babies. In the meantime, studied many other aspects of our biology. So the evolution of periods. More recently, I've been looking into the evolution of menopause. I'm actually, since we're talking about books, I'm thinking of reorienting this book for girls. So obviously it would look very different than a book for adults, but the idea is the same, taking girls through not just what is happening to their body at different stages of life, but why, like digging deeper to understand why do those things happen? Why do we get a period? Not just, what is happening when you get your first period and when you cycle, but why does that even happen to begin with? So that's the current project.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so evolutionary science can lead to improvements in women's health. Talk to us about these creatures and how do they figure into that big picture?
Yes, so I mentioned menopause, and that's sort of my focus right now. Human women obviously go through menopause. It's this big life transition, and then, it's really not menopause itself that's that surprising from sort of the evolutionary perspective because of the way that all mammals and actually all birds sort of set up our supply of eggs. So, we set up that supply very early in life, early in development, and then that's it. We can't make any more eggs. So the fact that we run out of eggs at menopause isn't that surprising. What's surprising is that we have this very extended period of life after we go through menopause. And these images are the other species that do this too. So up in the top left are orcas. And then clockwise, we've got beluga whales, narwhals, and short-finned pilot whales. These are all whales, and they're all toothed whales, which is interesting. There may be more. This is something that's difficult to study, especially, if you're trying to study creatures living in the water. We know the most about orcas, specifically resident orcas that eat salmon and live in the Pacific Northwest. So these animals can live into their 80s or 90s, and very similar to humans, they have their last offspring in their 40s. So it's a surprising trait, but it's not specific to humans. It exists in these other species.
Whoops, hold on. Because I wanted to bring the next The next creature up. Here we go.
Yes, so chimpanzees, up until very recently, the consensus was that they do go through menopause, actually, at the same age as human women, so around 50. But in the wilds, they don't live to that age. So there may be a female here or there that makes it to 50 and lives a little bit longer, but that's very rare, unlike in humans. But again, I just said until recently, there's this one population of chimpanzee in Uganda, wild's population of chimp, and a significant number of females in this population live a significant number of years past the age of menopause. This is super interesting because chimpanzees socially are very different from humans. For example, they don't grandmother at all the way that humans do. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So scientists are very interested in this population because it may tell us a little bit about how menopause first evolves. So lots of interest in this group of chimps, and I think they're going to tell us some really interesting things going forward.
So this next slide is all about your current research. So talk about
Yes.
bowheads and what the heck you're up to.
So I'm really interested in those species that go through menopause, but right now I'm actually more interested in long-lived mammals like the bowhead whale that seems to escape menopause. So bowhead whales are famous for their longevity. They're currently thought to be the longest lived mammal. They can live 200 years, which is truly remarkable. And from what we know, again, these animals are hard to study, but there are some native Inupiat populations in the Arctic that still hunt these animals for food. It's a very important part of their culture. And sometimes they hunt pregnant animals, and there's evidence of a female at like 130 being pregnant. So the ovaries of these female bowheads clearly are staying healthy for a much longer period of time than humans, which I find really interesting, and I am trying to understand this, both sort of at the genetic level, and I want to know what's happening in the ovaries. What is happening macroscopically, microscopically as these animals age.
So I'm going to interrupt you because she's going to continue on. This is one of the wildest efforts to promote research that I have ever had. So what's your next move with this one, Deena?
So I thought that I had access to these tissues. I was talking to these different groups, and I got a grant to study them, and it was like a 3-year grant, and I have gone up to Alaska twice. I have yet to convince the native whalers to share their tissues with me. They don't eat the ovaries, but they're protective for very good reasons. So I have been trying to get samples from the Alaskan whalers. It's much easier to deal with tissue in Alaska because it's the US. The Canadians, I'm also talking to the Canadians. They don't mind sharing the tissues with me, but they're in Canada. So we got our first sample. It was a pregnant female. We're estimating about 50. But the tissue is currently in Canada. So we're trying to figure out how to navigate that. I will probably go up and we'll process the samples up there. Is I think what will happen.
So what do you hope to find out from processing those samples?
I hope to find out what it is that's different about their ovaries that is enabling them to have babies at 130. Now, we know the ovaries are not just reproductive organs. We really think of them as the architects of health. in the female body. So, is there something that is happening in their ovaries that is keeping them healthy for such an extended period of time? And I want to find out what it is.
Good for you. Okay. Naked mole rats. These critters aren't they cute? They're studied in research on aging. What makes them of interest to you and others who are studying kind of the reproductive biology?
Yes. So I am not actively studying them right now. There are many folks interested in these animals. They live much longer than other rodents that are of similar size, which is really interesting. They don't get cancer. They have very unique biology. From thinking about their reproductive longevity, they're amazing. So the females can reproduce throughout that 20, 30-year lifespan. And actually, it turns out, so a recent study showed that they're very unique mammals. So most mammals, I think I mentioned, they set up their egg supply very early in life, and then that's it. You're stuck with that supply for your whole life. These very interesting animals seem to do things a little bit differently. So they seem to retain the stem cells that are needed to make new eggs. So they retain these stem cells into adulthood, very similar to all males. All male mammals retain their sperm stem cells, and that's why they're able to keep making sperm. The females in this species seem to be able to do that as well, which is really cool. There are lots of folks studying them. I haven't yet started with these guys. I'm focusing on the bowheads. It's been such a challenge.
I bet plenty. Okay, so now we are going to talk about menopause and life expectancy. So there's a controversy over menopause. Is it a trait in our species? And you know what? I was supposed to have a red line. We don't have the quite right slide, but we'll figure it out. So where you see 50, imagine a red line going across there that denotes where menopause happens. Okay.
Every time I speak about menopause, someone in the audience raises their hand and says, well, I don't think that menopause is a real trait in humans. It was uncovered recently because, modern medicine now allows humans to live so much longer. And a lot of people who make this argument will show a slide like this. This is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. So I'm gonna talk a little bit.
There's the red line. Oh. Whoops. Okay, great. Thank you, Chloe.
So this is a life expectancy graph. If you quickly glance at it, you might say, oh, humans before the 1900s didn't reach the age of menopause, which is that red line going across it. So menopause can't be a real trait in humans. It was just uncovered very recently. And that's wrong. I think part of the confusion is that, life expectancy is an average. And so it is very true that average life expectancy before the 1900s was very low, but the reason it was very low is that so many young babies died. And so that, of course, is going to drive your average way, way down. We know that when we look at populations around the globe that don't have access to medicine or sanitation, many, many women in those populations are not just reaching menopause, but living well beyond menopause. So I think this evidence, along with plenty of other evidence, suggests that menopause has been around for a long time. It's not, an artifact of, it's not a recent phenomenon.
So, in your own work and as you sort of survey the field, do you think that we're going to be able to delay menopause? Is that a realistic objective?
I think so. I think it's possible.
That's great.
Yep.
And as you talk about menopause, and we're going to get more into it later, What's your take on hormone replacement therapy? Because I thought there might be some people here interested in it. I see some heads shaking. So what's your take on that?
So I'm not a doctor, so remember that. I also tend to be very conservative. It's just like a personal quality of mine. So I don't like to intervene pharmacologically unless I need to. So if I was having debilitating hot flashes, I would talk to my doctor about HRT. If I wasn't having debilitating hot flashes, I would not. I don't believe menopause is a disease. I think that based on my studies of women around the globe, one can get through this transition without intervening, but our lives are really complicated now, so some of us might need it, and I think that's fine.
So I got a great question that's very apropos for this, and it has a great attitude. Why delay menopause? Postmenopause is pretty cool. So great attitude, but there could be some health benefits, right?
Yes.
From delaying menopause.
Yes. So, like I was saying earlier, the ovaries are not just reproductive organs. We know, for example, that a woman's risk of many diseases goes up when her ovaries stop doing their thing. So I think there are potential health benefits of delaying it. We have solutions now like HRT. That's not a perfect solution. There might be others, and that's sort of the goal of the research I'm doing and the research that many other folks are doing.
Great. And also I want to bring in, before we do the next slide, which I think speaks to it, is that in talking to you and reading the book, there's a lot of content about describing reproduction as an extremely costly investment for women. I don't know that those of you who have kids already get this, but why don't you talk about it? What's the cost? What's the investment in pregnancy?
Yeah, so female mammals, that includes us, but 5,000 other species, and female birds invest a lot in not just their pregnancies, but also lactation and caregiving. And that drives a lot of our biology. We'll maybe get into this a little bit later. I think that it may even be the reason why we go through menopause, but men don't. Our bodies have evolved to make a lot of choices about that investment. And I think one of the earliest choices is how we make our eggs. So, we talked about this, men, except for those naked mole rats, female mammals are making their eggs up front. And males don't do that. They keep these stem cells around, they keep making sperm throughout their life. The problem with that strategy is that any time you need these cells to continue dividing throughout life, and we know that any time a cell divides, there's this opportunity for a mutation to arise. And so, as we also know that most mutations enter the human gene pool through males, and in particular older males, and that's just a function of this biology. You keep these stem cells dividing and they're going to start accumulating mutations. All of that to say, for females who invest a lot in reproduction, they want to minimize the mutations that are accumulating in their eggs. So I think this strategy of where you stop your eggs from dividing very early in life may be one strategy to do that. We do lots of other things to sort of make the wisest choices that we can about reproduction. We'll get into that later, I think. But very costly. And anyone who's been through a pregnancy knows that. It's a huge investment of time, of energy.
And I just want to go back. So from my understanding from high school biology, the prime driving effort of evolution is just to focus on reproducing, right? Just to keep the genes going.
Yeah, the traits in the past that allowed some females to have more offspring than other females, so those are the ones that sort of propagated in the population. And so those are the traits that we're left with now. Absolutely.
Got a question. Do human eggs degrade as a woman gets older?
Yes. So, that system that I was just describing of, stockpiling your eggs and that being a way to protect them, that protects against one type of damage, but not all types of damage. So we don't do a perfect job of keeping those eggs pristine. And that you find that all over evolution. I think nature's done a pretty good job in most cases, but it's not perfect.
So these are I hope I pronounced it right, they're called Hadza, right? So this is a hunter-gatherer population. The graph on the left talks about their menopause, and I think these women have been used to advance theories of menopause. So what are we learning? What have we learned from hunter-gatherer populations?
Yes. So let's start with the chart. So Hadza women, Hadza are a hunter-gatherer group in Tanzania, and they have so let's focus, I want to connect this slide to the last one. They have a life expectancy of 37. Okay? So, young. Before this talk, you might have jumped to the conclusion that Hadza women never reached the age of menopause, but now you know better. And this graph kind of shows you what's actually happening. So, this is called a survivorship curve. So that red line is simply showing the proportion of Hadza females who are surviving with increasing age. And so what you'll notice is that very early in life, there's a really steep drop in survivorship. That's because lots of young Hadza babies die. So infant mortality is very high in these populations. Then things level off for a bit, and if you look at around 50, you'll see that about 40% of Hadza women, females who are born, make it to menopause. But, if you get to 70, 75 years, 20% of Hadza women who are born make it to that age. So, the life expectancy of 37 kind of obscures what's actually happening, which is lots of Hadza women live until they're past the age of 60, 70, even 80. So that's one graph that I like to show to really take that point home. And then, yes, so the Hadza, there's lots of theories on the evolution of menopause. I would say there's no consensus on why menopause evolved, but one of the most well-known theories is the grandmother hypothesis that actually was developed based on observations of the Hadza. And so what were those observations? Basically, Hadza grandmothers have a really important role in their communities. So a big food source for them are these root vegetables that are really hard to dig up and they're really hard to process. Think of, like a hard sweet potato or something. And so these Hadza females, older Hadza females, are digging these root vegetables up, they're processing them, and then they're feeding their grandchildren. And so these observations sort of led to this hypothesis connecting grandmothering behaviors like feeding the grandchildren and the evolution of menopause. And human grandmothering is, among the primates, pretty unique. So chimpanzee grandmothers are not digging up root vegetables and feeding their grandchildren. So this is sort of a new behavior. There's I don't like to get too deep into the weeds here. There's sort of a couple different versions of the grandmother hypothesis. One is that reproductive lifespan in humans was actually cut short. So it has to happen at 50 because grandmothers who stopped reproducing and started engaging in these grandmothering behaviors passed more of their genes to future generations than women who weren't doing that. Another version of the hypothesis says, no, we inherited menopause at 50. That's something that, apes were already doing. And, there is some evidence of that. Chimps go through menopause at the same age as we do, which suggests that our common ancestor went through menopause at 50. What that version of the grandmother hypothesis argues is that grandmothering led to the longer lifespan that we see in humans. So these new behaviors actually lengthened the human lifespan. I think there's mixed results, mixed support for these hypotheses. I don't know that, I think any of them are a great explanation. And these things are so hard to study. Grandmothering isn't preserved in the fossil record, so it's really hard to know.
So before we move on, I want to talk more about these hunter-gatherers. It's a little off topic. So how many of you have heard about the paleo diet? And you're supposed to do everything paleo. So these are paleo folks in present day. What's your take on all the fascination with the paleo stuff?
I have opinions. So, the paleo diet is meant to mimic the diet of our hunter-gatherer ancestors from the Paleolithic era. The Paleolithic era ended 10,000 years ago. We didn't stop evolving 10,000 years ago. So as an example, we know a lot about the evolution of lactose tolerance. So we know that around the globe, independently in many different places, as people started dairy farming, lactose tolerance evolved. So, in most mammals, you lose the ability to digest lactose after weaning, right? Because you're not consuming lactose after you wean. But it's actually a trait that evolved. Dairy is a great way to get your calories, your nutrition, if it doesn't bother you. And I would say the same for other, you're not supposed to eat wheat on the paleo diet. You're not supposed to eat beans. I love beans. So, I don't know, I tend to not buy into these fads. Now, obviously, our bodies aren't meant to consume highly processed foods that are, chock full of sugars and, other additives. That is not something that we're evolved to deal with yet. So I like to avoid those things as much as possible. But, these guys are eating carbs. They're eating these root vegetables. That's a major component of their diet. So I'm not a fan of the fad diets. I'll just leave it at that.
So before we move on, talk about these women and estrogen and what their reproductive life looks like.
Do we want to advance to the next?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the things that we've discovered as we've studied these hunter-gatherers around the globe is that their reproductive hormone profiles look very different from Western women. And so this graph is trying to illustrate that. This isn't looking at estrogen, it's looking at progesterone levels across the lifespan. And it's comparing 3 different populations, so a population from Boston, and then 2 other populations. The Lese is a hunter-gatherer population in the Congo. The Tamang live in Nepal. They're not hunter-gatherers, but they're farmers. But their diets and lifestyles are very, very different from those women in Boston. And I think it becomes immediately obvious that their progesterone levels are much higher than ours. And so that's one observation that people have made. And perhaps one explanation for why women in these populations don't experience menopause the way that we do. I don't know, do you want to get into that now?
Sure, you bet.
So another observation, like I said, is that hunter-gatherers typically don't experience those debilitating symptoms that come with menopause for many women in the West. And I think a compelling hypothesis, explanation for that is what you're seeing here. So we have much higher levels of reproductive hormones. It's very likely related to our diet and levels of physical activity. And when those levels drop at menopause, we have a much harder time with it. It's almost like we're having withdrawal symptoms from this drug that we had in our body our whole lives. And women in these other populations don't experience that because their levels were not quite as high. Their bodies are better adapted to low levels of those hormones.
And that's because they were pregnant and breastfeeding a whole bunch, right?
And also because they had their diet and, other aspects of their lifestyle are very different. So there's definitely a connection between exercise and reproductive hormone levels. So we know that, for example, hardcore athletes have, their reproductive cycles are even suppressed. So lower levels of reproductive hormones. So there's a connection between, it's not just that they're pregnant more often, it's also just their diets are different.
So the higher level of estrogen that those of us in the Western cultures have, are there any health outcomes that are related to that?
Yes, so another observation about these hunter-gatherer women around the world is they have much lower levels of cancer. So lower rates of reproductive cancers like breast cancer. And one thought is, our higher levels are involved in sometimes fueling those reproductive cancers. We also are cycling much more frequently than those women, so we spend much less of our life pregnant and much less time nursing. And so that more time we're spending cycling is correlated with those higher, that higher risk of cancer.
Good question here. Can going through a, quote, bad menopause cause major health issues later in life? And then somebody wants to know, and you may not know the answer to this, what are the hormonal characteristics that you see in individuals who experience late onset menopause?
Late onset menopause is, very interested in that scientifically, because those women also tend to live longer. What was the first question?
The first question was, can going through a bad menopause cause major health issues?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that there probably is a connection.
Talk to your doctor.
Talk to your doctor.
Talk to your doctor. Okay. So as we talk about estrogen, let's talk about these young tween girls. So there's evidence that these kids are entering puberty sooner than many of us did. So what's going on here, and are there any implications?
Yeah, this is a great topic that lots of people are interested in. So it's absolutely true. There's this secular trend of girls going through puberty earlier than definitely their great-grandmothers, even their grandmothers. And I would say that there's two explanations for this, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is, so we know, for example, that the timing of puberty is highly heritable. So there's a big genetic component to when you go through puberty. But our genes aren't setting the day that you get your first period. They're sort of just setting the bounds of when it's going to happen. And there's all sorts of environmental sort of inputs that feed into that decision. And this is all evolved. I mean, our bodies, not just human bodies, but mammalian bodies evolved this way. If a female is highly stressed when she's, in that age around puberty, not getting enough food, the body has evolved to hold off on going through puberty. And the flip of that is if a female is getting lots of calories, so she's eating a lot, that's a signal to the body, hey, this body is ready. It is going to be able to support a pregnancy. It's going to be able to support lactation. Let's get this going. Let's have this body go through puberty. And this is, again, all built into the system. And so I think one of the reasons that girls are going through puberty earlier has to do with this. It's all part of how our bodies are built. We know that rates of childhood obesity are going way up. So there's a lot more overweight and obese girls now compared to a couple hundred years ago. And so I think that's one reason why girls are going through puberty earlier. It's basically a signal to the body when you're getting extra calories to start your reproductive cycling, because you're going to be able to support a pregnancy, or at least that's what the signal is telling the body. I think there's another potential cause, which is, I'm sure you've all heard of these, toxins. They're called endocrine disrupting chemicals. They're found in everything that we slather on our bodies, all the cleaning products we use, all the food containers have these potential toxins. And, we know these toxins do lots of bad things. We know they're connected to infertility, breast cancer. The data on that connection between early puberty and these toxins, I would say, is a little fuzzier. I'm not convinced yet, but there's some hints that these toxins may be part of this trend that we're seeing of earlier puberty. The last thing I wanted to say on this, this is very weird from an evolutionary perspective. We're meant to go through puberty around the same time that we're able to deal with having children, so this, I would say, is like the first time in human history where there's this huge mismatch between when your body's physically able to reproduce and when you're, psychosocially able to reproduce. I mean, people aren't financially ready, they're not socially ready until much, much later. So it's this very odd mismatch. We also know that early puberty is tied to lots of adverse health outcomes for girls later in life. It's not clear why that is true. I think probably obesity explains some of that connection. But yeah, it's something that a lot of people are interested in and trying to understand and figure out what to do about this.
So I was really thrilled that I had a chance to moderate a scientific gathering that would sort of touch on politics a little bit. So Deena wrote this op-ed that appeared in the Boston Globe after the Supreme Court cut back Roe versus Wade. So it's all about reproductive choice is at the core of being a female mammal. So how are we hardwired for this?
Yeah, so when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I felt that I had to do something, and the thing that felt obvious to me was I have a very unique perspective, obviously, on reproductive choice as someone who studies female mammals in the level of detail that I study them. And really, what I have learned over the course of my career is that choice, and these aren't conscious choices, but they are choices, are at the very, very core of who we are as not just humans, but as female mammals. I think these reproductive choices are some of the most ancient and fundamental parts of our biology. And there's so many examples of this. And I think women's fight for reproductive rights is really just an extension of this thing that we've been doing for hundreds of millions of years. So,
give me some examples. How do we make choices inherently?
I mean, some of these choices are very specific to the species. The image that they put on the front of the article was of these bottlenose dolphins. We can talk about them first. People find this topic fascinating. People think of dolphins as really cute and playful, which is all true, but it turns out the males are also awful. They they basically will gang rape the females, and she is left with very little choice about who fathers her offspring. And it turns out that females care a lot about who fathers their offspring. In species where the fathers are involved in caring for the kids, females, of course, want to choose a father who is going to be a good one. But in species like bottlenose dolphins, where the father is not involved at all in care, the females still care a lot. They care about the genes that father is handing over to the offspring. And so, I mean, this story is so wild. So there's lots of dolphin species. They're not all the same. So males in some dolphin species are much milder mannered. And males in many species, including the bottlenose dolphin, are really aggressive. And like I said, will gang rape the females. And you might think that, it's that the males are controlling the picture here, but when people started studying the reproductive anatomy of these animals, what they realized is that females really aren't letting males have the last word. And so when you look at their anatomy, it's incredible. Basically, the female bottlenose dolphin and other species independently evolved this, where males are extremely aggressive. The reproductive tract of the female is incredibly convoluted. It's all twisted up and spiraled, which, at first glance you think, how is this conducive to successful reproduction? It is much harder when you have that type of anatomy for the sperm to meet the egg. It turns out that females have evolved this anatomy to retain some control over who is fathering the offspring. So if they don't like the male who is essentially raping her, they can contort their body in a way where the sperm is led to a dead end in the reproductive tract of the female. And if she wants the sperm of that male, she'll let the sperm up. I mean, it's just amazing. We see the same thing in ducks. Mallard ducks are also very, very aggressive. And in species where the males are aggressive, the females have evolved, again, this twisted up vagina that doesn't make any sense unless you think about it in this context of reproductive choice. So anyway, this is one of many examples. Choices are made at all different levels. So it's not just the choice of male, it's also the choice of which egg to ovulate. I mentioned earlier, even that choice of stockpiling your eggs, I would consider a reproductive choice to limit the mutations that might accumulate in those eggs with age. One thing that I have studied is the choice that the uterus makes. So I mentioned that my PhD was on the evolution of basically uterine tissues. One of the choices that has evolved is the choice of which embryo to retain. So our uterine lining actually has the ability to distinguish between embryos that look unhealthy developmentally and ones that look healthy. And the endometrium of the uterus will actually prevent an unhealthy embryo from implanting, and is, much more welcoming to an embryo that it detects is healthy. Again, these aren't foolproof systems, but this is a system that evolved, I would say, again, as part of this greater theme here of reproductive choice at many different levels. And there are lots of other examples. So read the article. There's lots of very wild examples out there.
You'll get a link to this in the email, so yes. So the final slide that we have, these are Deena's kids. So as I read your book, I was just struck by both how beautiful nature and evolution is, how elegant, but also it's pretty brutal. And I started looking at human relationships differently. So there's your kids. What's hardwired in us as we interact with each other and we interact as families? Do you bring any of that when you're dealing with your kids?
Yes. I'm not sure if I had chosen a different profession, if I would be a different parent. Perhaps. I would say, I mentioned sort of when the idea of the book came to me, one of the things that I became really interested in as I was, studying for those qualifying exams was the idea that there's this genetic conflict of interest that exists between family members. So that's between mothers and fathers. Maybe that's not super surprising because you're not genetically related to a spouse or a partner, but it also exists between mothers and their kids, between siblings. So even between individuals who are genetically related, there are these conflicts of interest. And that was surprising. You're kind of conditioned to believe that we have the same interests as our family members, but we don't, because we're not genetically identical to our family members, unless, of course, you have an identical twin. So I became really obsessed with these conflicts, and a lot of my book talks about them and sort of how they manifest. A lot of it manifests in the uterus, because that's the site where decisions are being made on how much food basically to give to each individual baby. Babies want as much as possible. Mothers want the baby to make it, but they want future babies to make it too. So the evidence that we see is that, the uterus is trying to control things, whereas the fetal side of the placenta just wants more. So anyway, back to the big question, has this affected the way I parent? Maybe. You'd have to ask my kids. I think maybe I'm a little more forgiving, more patient. I don't know if you asked my kids that, whether they'd use those words to describe me, but perhaps.
Yeah, well, it helped me understand why kids maybe squabble over who gets the last pizza, or, who gets the toy.
Yeah, because, again, it comes back to, siblings are not genetically identical to each other. And, it's a little bit out of context now in my house. There's plenty to go around for all kids, but in the past, there wasn't. In our human ancestors, maybe that kid who, squeaked a little louder got more of the food. So, these conflicts of interest do, I think, still pop up in our relationships with our siblings, with our parents. There's a lot that feeds into these behaviors. So I wouldn't say it's hardwired, but I think there are hints of that conflict in my house, for sure.
And I hope this helps explain your relationships better, too, when your kids or grandkids are driving you crazy. Okay, thank you, Deena, for being here. I want to thank all of you for being here as well. So what happens next, you're going to get the email with the link to today's events and some links to content that covers some of what we talked to. So Deena and I have a lunch to go to, but we're both going to hang around a little bit afterwards in case you have some questions for her. What comes next is I'm going to be back here on November 5th. My guest will be Buck Professor Julie Anderson. She is the perfect person to talk to us about, are there really good drugs to treat neurodegeneration? Julie's lab studies both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. I expect this event to fill up quickly. You will get a chance to register, I'm pretty sure, with today's email. If you're interested, sign up now. So then, let's see. Clinical trials. So we didn't talk about those today. We usually do. The Buck is involved in clinical trials involving humans. It's one of the most exciting things happening here. You can get information on our website. Also out in the atrium, we're going to have folks from our clinical research unit who are going to be available to talk to you, answer any questions that you might have about our clinical trials. So I always say that the smartest people in Marin come to these events. If you want to be a little bit smarter, I encourage you to take advantage of our Buck Academy. We have an online class. It's free. It's all about learning about the biology of aging. It gets great reviews. I think you would enjoy it. Also, we're just getting ready to launch our third season of a really great podcast called We're Not Getting Any Younger Yet. It features interviews with researchers on aging from across the country and actually internationally. So if you like podcasts, I recommend this one. If you are new to the Buck, please come on a tour. We have them every Tuesday and Thursday mornings. You can sign up on our website and come back and really get a sense of our history and our architecture and our science. You can keep up with the Buck. We're on social media. Go on our website. You can sign up for our newsletter. If you're interested in what you're knowing, we try to make it easy for you to follow us. And then finally, I would be remiss if I did not make a fundraising pitch. Donations really matter here at the Buck. Our clinical research program actually got kickstarted by a donor who that wouldn't have happened without this donor's, Dr. Jim Johnson's investment in the Buck. Every gift, no matter what size, matters. It supports our research. So please consider us and be as generous as you possibly can be. Okay, I want to thank you. I will be back here on November 5th, and I hope you will be too. Thank you so much for coming.